Valen was not like the others of his kind, where most vampires reveled in the night, using their immortality for power and indulgence. Valen sought solitude, feeding only when necessary and causing as little harm as possible. For centuries, he had wandered the earth, quietly observing humanity from the shadows, and in rare moments, stepping in to protect the innocent. In a forgotten town nestled between mountains, Valen found himself drawn to a young woman named Elise. She worked as a healer, tending to the sick and dying with a grace and compassion that reminded him of the humanity he had lost. Her presence warmed his cold and dead heart, stirring something deep inside him he thought had long been extinguished. One evening, Valen stumbled upon Elise as she was returning home from a late visit to a sick child. The moonlight bathed her in an ethereal glow, and before Valen could stop himself, he approached her, careful to remain hidden in the shadows. "I have watched you," he said softly, his voice a whisper in the wind. Startled, Elise glanced around, her eyes finally landing on the dark figure standing at the edge of the forest. Though fear flickered across her face, there was also a strange sense of calm. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously, stepping closer. Valen hesitated, struggling with the urge to reveal himself. "I am a traveler of sorts. I admire what you do, helping those in need." She studied him for a moment, sensing a profound sadness behind his words. "It is not without its burdens," she said quietly, "but I do what I can." Over time, Valen and Elise began to speak more often, their conversations brief but meaningful. Valen never revealed his true nature, though he longed to tell her the truth. For the first time in centuries, he felt the pull of companionship, of a connection that went beyond his cursed existence. Yet, he knew such a bond was dangerous. He could never be part of her world, and she could never be part of his. But one fateful night, disaster struck. A terrible sickness swept through the village, one unlike anything Elise had ever encountered. People were dying within hours of falling ill, their bodies racked with agony. Elise worked tirelessly, but it was clear that nothing she did could halt the plague's advance. Desperate to save her, Valen revealed himself to her in a moment of vulnerability. "I can help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he stepped out from the shadows, his pale skin and sharp fangs gleaming in the dim light. Elise recoiled in shock but did not flee. "What? Are you?" "A vampire," Valen admitted, his eyes filled with sorrow. "But I am not like the others. I do not wish to harm you or anyone else, but there is something I can do to stop this plague. I can turn them, or I can turn you, and you will live forever, untouched by this sickness." Elise stared at him, torn between fear and hope. She knew the price of immortality was steep, but the prospect of death, of seeing her loved ones die, weighed heavily on her. "I don't know if I can bear the burden of what you are," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Valen reached out, his cold hand brushing against hers. "It is not an easy existence, but I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to make it bearable." After a long, agonizing pause, Elise nodded. "Do it." Valen bit into her neck, his fangs piercing her skin, and he wept as he drank. But something went horribly wrong. Instead of the smooth transition from life to undeath, Elise's body convulsed violently. Her veins blackened, and her skin turned ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "No!" Valen cried, trying to stop what he had set in motion. But it was too late. Elise had become something else, something twisted and feral. Her once kind heart had turned cold and vengeful, her mind consumed by an insatiable hunger. She lashed out at Valen, her new strength overwhelming, and fled into the night, leaving him behind, heartbroken and shattered. Valen fell to his knees, his hands stained with her blood. He had tried to save her, but instead, he had damned her to a fate far worse than death. Now, a new terror stalked the mountains, a creature born of his kindness gone awry. Valen swore to find her, to somehow undo the horror he had created. But deep down, he knew that Elise, the woman he had loved from afar, was gone forever. Yet, there was one question that haunted him. Why had the transformation gone so terribly wrong? As the moon rose high in the sky, Valen disappeared into the shadows, following the path of destruction Elise had left in her wake. knowing that the mystery of her cursed transformation was far from over. The trail of destruction Elise left in her wake was unlike anything Valen had ever seen. The villagers she encountered did not die like victims of ordinary vampires. They were twisted into grotesque versions of themselves, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, their eyes glazed with madness. Some became ravenous creatures, attacking anything in their path, while others were paralyzed in a state of near death, endlessly suffering but unable to find release. Valen moved silently through the dark forests, the remnants of Elise's passage still fresh in the air. He had once hoped that love, or at least kindness, could redeem him, but now, every drop of blood he had spilled reminded him of the terrible mistake he had made. The sickness that had plagued the village had faded, but something darker had taken its place, an unnatural force that seemed to infect the very land itself. Crops withered, animals grew sickly and aggressive, and the nights grew longer. Whatever Elise had become, it was something far more dangerous than Valen could have anticipated. It was as if his bite had awakened something ancient, something that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise. One night, as Valen crossed the threshold of a mountain pass, he was ambushed. From the shadows, a figure lunged at him, a man twisted and malformed, his face gaunt and his eyes glowing with a sickly green light. Valen dodged the attack with supernatural speed, but the man was relentless, hissing and snarling like a wild animal. His strength was immense, far beyond that of a normal human, but there was something familiar in his sense, something that reminded Valen of Elise. After a brutal struggle, Valen managed to overpower the creature, pinning him to the ground. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp with desperation. "What has she done to you?" The man thrashed beneath him, his voice a guttural growl. She is the first, but there will be more. She is the key. She is the queen." Valen froze, a cold dread creeping into his bones. "The queen?" he echoed, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" The man's eyes rolled back in his head, his body seizing violently before falling limp. Whatever dark magic had twisted him into this form had finally consumed him, leaving Valen with more questions than answers. Valen stood over the body, his heart pounding in his chest. The queen. He had heard whispers of an ancient prophecy, long forgotten even among vampires, about a being who would rise from darkness to rule over both the living and the dead. But that had always been dismissed as myth, a tale told to frighten fledgling vampires. Could Elise's transformation have triggered something far older, far more dangerous than even he had imagined? As dawn approached, Valen buried the creature's body and made his way to the ruins of an ancient castle that loomed in the distance. It was a place that even the oldest vampires feared, a place of dark magic and forbidden knowledge. If he was going to understand what had gone wrong with Elise, he needed answers that only the ancient texts held. But as he approached the castle, a strange feeling gripped him, a sense of being watched, of being followed. He could hear the soft rustle of leaves, the distant crack of branches. His instincts told him to be on guard, yet when he turned to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows, there was nothing there. He pressed on, his mind haunted by the image of Elise, her once kind face twisted in madness. As he entered the castle's crumbling halls, he could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him. The air was thick with the stench of decay and old magic, but Valen was determined. He had to find a way to stop Elise before she became something even worse. In the heart of the castle, Valen found what he was looking for, an ancient tome, bound in cracked leather and written in a language older than time itself. As he carefully opened the book, his eyes scanned the faded pages, searching for anything that could explain Elise's transformation. And there it was, buried within a passage about an ancient ritual. The sickness that had ravaged the village was no ordinary plague. It had been a curse unleashed by an ancient and forgotten god, one whose power had long been sealed away. Elise had been infected by this curse, and when Valen had turned her, he had inadvertently released the god's essence into her. She was now its vessel, and the transformation had only begun. Valen's heart sank. If the ancient texts were correct, Elise would soon become something far more dangerous, a creature with the power to command both the living and the dead, capable of plunging the world into eternal darkness. And worse still, There was a prophecy attached to this ritual. Once the vessel fully transformed, the god would rise again, using her as its avatar to reclaim the world. A cold wind swept through the chamber, blowing out the candles that lit the room. Valen's eyes darted to the doorway, where a figure now stood, half shrouded in shadow. It was Elise, but she was no longer the woman he had known. Her once soft features had sharpened, her eyes glowing with an eerie light, and a cruel smile played at her lips. She was beautiful, in a way that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "Valen," she purred, her voice echoing in the dark chamber. "You cannot stop what has begun. I am reborn." Valen's heart broke at the sight of her. "Elise," he whispered, his voice filled with sorrow. "I never wanted this for you." She tilted her head, her smile widening. "You didn't want it, but you gave it to me all the same. And now, there is no going back." The ancient prophecy was unfolding before his very eyes, and Valen knew that the battle to stop it was only just beginning. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and Elise, the woman he had once loved, was now the key to it all. And yet, deep down, Valen still clung to a desperate hope. Could he find a way to save her? Or was she truly lost to him forever? As she stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with power, Valen prepared himself for the fight of his immortal life. But the real question remained. Was he fighting to stop her, or to save her? Valen stood still, his mind in turmoil as Elise approached, her steps slow and deliberate. The woman he had loved was gone, replaced by something darker, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Yet, despite everything, he refused to believe that the goodness in her was completely lost. "Elise," he whispered again, his voice trembling with emotion. "I know you're still in there. I know what you've become, but I also know the woman you once were. You don't have to let this curse control you." She paused, just a few feet away from him, her eyes narrowing as if she were studying him. For a brief moment, the eerie glow in her eyes flickered, and Valen thought he saw a flash of the old Elise kind, compassionate and gentle, buried deep within the monstrous exterior. "You're wrong," she said softly, but there was an uncertainty in her voice that hadn't been there before. "I am no longer that woman. I am something more now, something greater." "You're stronger." "Yes," Valen said, taking a step closer. "But you're still Elise. The curse may have twisted you, but it doesn't define who you are. You still have a choice." Her expression wavered, but then the darkness seemed to surge through her again. She snarled, her voice growing cold once more. "You think you can save me? You think you can stop what's coming? You can't, Valen. The ancient god's power is flowing through me, and soon, the world will bow to its will." Valen's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to give up. He knew that the battle before him wasn't just physical, it was a battle for Elise's soul. "There is always a way," Valen said firmly. "The power of the ancient god may be strong, but you are stronger. I know you, Elise. I know the strength of your heart. You have the power to fight this, to resist it." She stared at him, her face twisted with conflicting emotions. "You don't understand," she shouted, her voice shaking. "The curse is too strong. I can feel it consuming me, taking everything that I was. I can't fight it," Valen interrupted, stepping even closer. "You are not alone in this. I will help you. We can break this curse together." Elise's eyes glowed brighter, her body trembling as the power of the ancient god warred with her own will. The air around them grew thick with dark energy, crackling with power. Valen could see that she was struggling, caught between the darkness and the light. He reached out and took her hands in his, ignoring the coldness that radiated from her skin. "I believe in you," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "You have the strength to overcome this." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Elise's face twisted in pain as the dark power surged within her, and Valen feared that he had lost her forever. But then, slowly, the glow in her eyes began to fade. Her breathing grew ragged as she fought against the ancient god's influence, her fingers tightening around Valen's hands. I can't," she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. "Yes, you can," Valen said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm with you. I'll never leave you." Elise closed her eyes, focusing all of her energy on resisting the curse. Slowly, Painfully, the darkness began to recede. The power of the ancient god fought back, trying to claw its way back into control. But Elise was stronger. With Valen's help, she forced the dark magic out of her body, rejecting its influence. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, and Elise collapsed into Valen's arms. The dark energy that had surrounded her dissipated, vanishing into the air as if it had never existed. The ancient god's hold on her was broken. "Elise," Valen whispered, his heart racing as he held her. "Elise, can you hear me?" She stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. The eerie glow was gone, replaced by the warm, familiar gaze that Valen had known before. She was pale and weak, but the madness had left her. I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You saved me." Tears filled Valen's eyes as he held her close. "You saved yourself," he whispered. "You're free now, Elise. The curse is broken." Elise smiled weakly, resting her head against his chest. "I never could have done it without you," she said softly. "Thank you, Valen." For a moment, they simply held each other, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. But they had won. Elise was free from the curse, and the ancient god's power had been vanquished. As dawn began to break over the mountains, casting a golden light over the landscape, Valen helped Elise to her feet. Though she was still weak, there was a newfound strength in her eyes, a strength that came from knowing she had overcome the darkness. "Where do we go from here?" Elise asked quietly, glancing at Valen. He smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Wherever you want," he said. "We have all the time in the world." Together, they walked away from the ancient castle, leaving the shadows of the past behind them. The world was still dangerous, and there were still challenges ahead, but for now, they had found peace. They had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side, stronger and more united than ever before. And as they disappeared into the light of a new day, Valen knew that, for the first time in centuries, there was hope. He had finally found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. And it was love.